or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Dan, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the July 25th through 26th, 2026 issues of the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Starting on the front cover, Bahrain and Kuwait hit Iran in rare reprisal. U.S. allies covertly conducted airstrikes earlier this month, a first since war began, by Summer Syed and Shelby Halliday. Bahrain and Kuwait secretly sent jets to attack sites inside Iran, their first such direct retaliation against Tehran and an indication of the difficult position Arab states find themselves in as the war grinds on, people familiar with the matter said. The airstrikes this month targeted drone and missile storage depots, among other military sites, some of the people said. The United Arab Emirates, which attacked Iran multiple times early in the war, provided intelligence on targets and defensive air cover for the strikes in a sign of budding Arab cooperation in confronting Iran, those people said. Iran for weeks has focused in its retaliatory strikes on Bahrain and Kuwait, both of which host U.S. military bases. The two Persian Gulf states have relatively small air forces, armed with U.S. and European jets, but didn't want to let Tehran continue to hit them with impunity, the people said. The UAE said it supports a reduction in tensions in the region, including a full opening of the Strait of Hormuz, a critical route for Gulf oil exports. Its foreign ministry condemned the attacks on Kuwait and Bahrain and said it stands in full solidarity with these states and reaffirms its support for all measures aimed at safeguarding their security and stability. Kuwait's ambassador to the U.S. denied that his country struck Iran. The state of Kuwait has not participated in any military operations against Iran, nor has it permitted its territory to be used to launch offensive operations against any neighboring state, Ambassador Al-Zain al-Sabah said. A Bahraini government spokesperson didn't reply to a request to comment. Their dilemma is reflected more broadly across the Gulf, whose Arab governments are stuck between a war they didn't want and a much larger and aggrieved neighbor in Iran. Collectively, they absorbed the bulk of the punishment inflicted by Iran throughout the war and are now reckoning with the likelihood of an extended standoff that threatens their security and economies. The war continuing in the manner that it is playing out right now is the worst-case scenario, said Dina Esfandari, a Middle East analyst at the Bloomberg Economics. That is because it does not give them the opportunity to rebuild and maintain their image as a haven for stability in an unstable region. It affects their very models. The UAE got involved in the conflict early on, carrying out dozens of airstrikes against Iran from the beginning of the war and continuing through the day after a ceasefire was announced in April. The Wall Street Journal has reported this. Iran has generally avoided striking the country in recent weeks, though it hit two Emirati oil tankers this month. Kuwait and Bahrain are in a particularly tough spot. For decades, neither country has been on good terms with Iran. Esfandari said that they have been prime targets in the recent wave of fighting. Now Iran is stepping up its attacks to hit more critical infrastructure. Kuwait's foreign ministry said Sunday that Iran targeted a power plant and water desalination facility, calling it a threat to its citizens and a dangerous escalation. Countries like Oman and Qatar have long triangulated between Iran and the West and have shown little appetite for confrontation with Tehran. Saudi Arabia joined the UAE in attacking Iran earlier in the war, but is evaluating its position, people familiar with the matter said. Arab governments in the region had hoped the war would end quickly and let them get back to focusing on their economies. But the conflict is now in its fifth month with no sign of either side getting what it wants or backing down. Gulf oil exports have been crippled by Iran's chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz. A new threat emerged this week with a Red Sea blockade and strikes on shipping by Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi militia. Tourism in the region has dried up and investment is under pressure. Arab governments are weighing whether they need to become more aggressive in trying to pry open their critical trade routes. I think Gulf countries are beginning to realize that this war will continue for some time now, said Umar Karim, a researcher focused on Saudi policy and Gulf geopolitics at the University of Birmingham. This eventually means that they would have to confront Iran openly. Governments are even starting to countenance the idea of regime change in Tehran, he said, because existing in the same neighborhood with this Iranian regime will effectively mean subservience to Iranian hegemony. Heat waves fuel wildfires rampaging across Europe. Thousands have been evacuated as blazes increasingly threaten population centers. And then on a picture for this article is some firefighters that look like they're kind of climbing down into a gully with fire raging in bushes and trees and whatnot, and also there's an earth mover there as well. The caption reads, "Firefighters battled a blaze west of Madrid on Friday. Spanish authorities declared a national emergency in the region." Paris. A summer of heat waves has left Europe vegetation dangerously dry. Now this tinderbox is going up in flames. Wildfires are raging across the southwest of the continent, forcing authorities to evacuate thousands of people from tourist resorts and other areas near population centers. On Friday, authorities ordered the evacuation of 40,000 people from Cape Ferret, a peninsula in southwestern France that draws wealthy vacationers to its white sand beaches. Fast-spreading flames blackened the sky over the peninsula as tourists scrambled onto boats that ferried them to safety. Spain declared its first-ever national emergency in response to wildfires, which are expanding in and around the Madrid region and that have forced the evacuation of more than 19,000 people. Authorities have been caught off guard by the scale and intensity of this year's wildfires. Since June, a succession of heat waves have pummeled the continent, straining its infrastructure and drying out swaths of territory. More than 628,606 acres have burned across Europe this year, an 84% increase from the continent's 20-year average. President Emmanuel Macron said France is seeking reinforcements to help battle the blaze, including Canada aircraft from Croatia and Black Hawk helicopters from the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The situation remains under very high tension, Macron said. This summer's blazes stand out for their proximity to populated areas that typically are shielded from fires. The fires around Madrid remained out of control on Friday, with Spanish officials saying that two major blazes southwest of the capital had merged, further complicating efforts to extinguish them. The scale of the disaster has no recent precedent, local officials said. People have been evacuated from nursing homes, campsites, public buildings, and private homes as the flames encroach on urban areas. "We are living through a dramatic situation," Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said. The Cape Ferret Peninsula, lined with sweeping dunes and waterfront estates, is a 30-mile drive from the city of Bordeaux. French officials said at least 50 homes there were destroyed in fires that have burned more than 24,000 acres. A separate fire burning near the town of Biscarrosse, just south of Bordeaux, forced the evacuation of 23,000 people. Video footage captured chaotic scenes with horses galloping through traffic to flee the flames. Cyclospora Outbreak Probe adds 4 more states, by Joseph de Avila and Betsy McKay. Public health officials are investigating 4 additional states as part of a multi-state cyclospora outbreak linked to iceberg lettuce. Illinois, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania are the latest states added to the investigation, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said Friday. The health agency has said it was investigating the outbreak in Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, and West Virginia. The CDC said epidemiologic data continue to show the outbreak stemmed from the consumption of iceberg lettuce from Taylor Farms. Nearly 2,000 people who ate food from Taco Bell have been sickened in those 9 states during the outbreak, the agency said. Nearly 100 people have been hospitalized. The iceberg lettuce outbreak might be even broader than what health authorities have found. The authorities are investigating a number of food-related outbreaks, including several involving Cyclospora, a bacteria that causes diarrhea. For now, the authorities are probing the various Cyclospora outbreaks as if they are distinct, but it is possible they are related, and investigators so far haven't been able to connect them. Getting to the bottom of foodborne illnesses is challenging, partly because the contaminated food might not be readily available by the time that health authorities become aware of a problem and look into it. Also, many people don't become sick right away. In some cases, go unreported. Many people recover from the disease without medical care and don't get tested, they said. There have been nearly 4,200 laboratory-confirmed cases of cyclosporiasis, the intestinal illness caused by the parasite, across 41 states as of Monday, according to the health agency. An additional 7,400 suspected cases have also been reported. In North Carolina, at least 561 cases of cyclosporiasis have been reported, including 16 hospitalizations. A majority of cases are in the Raleigh area. Officials at the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services said the cases didn't appear to be associated with an outbreak involving Taco Bell, but they haven't pinpointed the exact source or sources. Many people who have been sick have eaten parsley, cilantro, and lettuce, officials said. Testing of food products hasn't included lettuce from Taylor Farms, they said. Genetic analysis of clinical specimens from North Carolina conducted at the CDC shows some clusters in the state, but not a connection to cases in other states. Dr. Carl Williams, state public health veterinarian and an epidemiologist, said this past week. Most states need to send cyclospora specimens to the CDC for genetic fingerprinting because their own public health laboratories can't do it, Williams said. They have a lot of specimens to go through, and I suspect there's a backlog, he said. Many fresh fruits and vegetables carry cyclospora, and it's likely that there are multiple sources of the outbreak, Williams said. It's not a single source or a single food product from a single company. Large numbers of cases have been reported in June and July in the state in the past 2 years, but the number this year is higher, Williams said. Trump Trade Map Gets New Route by Greg Ip. The House of Representatives Trade Oversight Committee maintains a compilation of all U.S. trade statutes. More than 1,400 pages, it is an authoritative reference among trade experts and attorneys. A decade ago, veteran trade lawyer John Verneau noticed it didn't include Section 338 of the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Law of 1930, which authorizes tariffs against countries that discriminate against the U.S. When he pointed this out, he recalled, a committee staffer said, "Surely this has been repealed." It wasn't, and this past week, President Trump said he would use it for the first time in its near-century existence to hit Canada with 50% tariffs. When the Supreme Court struck down Trump's main tariff weapon in February, the president's trade war seemed destined to enter a less capricious and more constrained phase. To Trump, though, court rulings are roadmaps, not roadblocks. February's court ruling simply rerouted him to tools the court hadn't explicitly prohibited. And fortunately for Trump, Congress has over the years scattered many such tools through the law books, many largely forgotten or unused. In the past 2 weeks, Trump has announced tariffs of 25% on Brazil, 50% on Canada, and up to 200% on generic drugs. And on Thursday, tariffs of 10% to 12.5% across as many as 60 trading partners. Friday came new threats aimed at the European Union in response to fines against U.S. tech firms. The upshot: Trump can wage a trade war that is as sweeping as before the Supreme Court's ruled. Tariffs are central to Trump's vision of presidential power, a catalyst for national rejuvenation, a source of revenue, and an all-purpose crowbar to force allies and its adversaries alike to do what he wants, from lowering their own trade barriers to surrendering territory. The vision runs up against the Constitution, which gives Congress authority over tariffs and taxes, except when delegated to the president for specific reasons. It also breaks with the bipartisan consensus in Congress that trade policy should enhance strategic bonds with allies and neighbors. Early on, Trump thought he had just the device to sidestep both constraints: the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. Originally intended to sanction rogue nations like Iran, he claimed it let him tariff anyone for any reason indefinitely. He used it for his first big tariffs, supposedly over fentanyl, against Canada, Mexico, and China, and then in April 2025 against almost everyone. In February, though, the Supreme Court said the law didn't explicitly authorize tariffs and that Congress wouldn't delegate as much of its power to the president without expressly saying so. Trump immediately sought to accomplish the same thing using different laws. Section 122 to impose a temporary 10% universal tariff, Section 232 and Section 301 to set industry and country-specific tariffs. Trump has boasted his IEEPA tariffs would raise enough money to replace the income tax. Though an exaggeration, it hurts his case at the Supreme Court since taxes are clearly Congress's purview. Yet with these new tariffs, even Core ISI, an investment bank, estimates Trump will raise $240 billion to $260 billion a year, about 20% less than before the Supreme Court ruling, and still triple the pre-Trump level. Trump likes to impose and repeal tariffs without notice for maximum effect. The problem with 232 and 301 is that they require lengthy periods of investigation and comment, not 338 though. This is possibly the new IEEPA, said Saren Bianchi, a former trade official under President Joe Biden who is now a policy analyst with the Evercore ISI. If he's able to use this tariff for leverage, I don't know why he wouldn't keep trying. As to which one is next, the European Union would be on your list. Verneau, a trade official under then-President George W. Bush and now senior counsel at Covington, said Section 338 was aimed at countries that discriminate against the U.S. relative to other partners. Its goal was the most favored nation status, that is, equal treatment of all trading partners, which the U.S. was able to achieve through negotiation. Trump's use of 338 is ironic, if not perverse, Verneau said, because under the North American Free Trade Agreement, now the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, Canada gives the U.S. better access than it does to most other countries. It was Trump who then overrode those pacts to hit Canada with duties on steel, aluminum, autos, and other goods. Canada retaliated, and Trump is now punishing Canada for retaliating. In effect, he is laying down the principle that discrimination is acceptable as long as it is the U.S. doing the discriminating. Under USMCA, Canada does restrict U.S. dairy imports. Trump claims the EU gets better terms. Trump regularly deviates from the original intent of the trade law he deploys. Section 122 was aimed at balance of payments problems, a feature of a fixed exchange rate system that ended over 50 years ago. Section 232 is meant to protect industries vital to national security, which Trump now defines to include everything from lumber to generic drugs. Section 301 is aimed at unfair practices that discriminate against U.S. products, such as China's industrial subsidies. It will now be used to penalize other countries' failure to police their own imports for forced labor. That these are pretexts haven't mattered to courts, who have declined to block any. Many in Congress regret ceding so much power to the president on tariffs. It's well past time to put Congress back in the driver's seat on trade, Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat from Oregon, said at a Senate Finance Committee hearing Wednesday. And yet Congress might be about to cede to Trump even more power. Just before he died, Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina, had finally persuaded Trump to back a bill imposing tariffs on Russia for invading Ukraine, and the largest buyers of its oil and gas. At Trump's behest, the bill was weakened, allowing Trump to issue waivers. The bill is gaining support in the Senate, while its fate in the House is unclear. The bill would enable Trump to use tariffs instead of sanctions for geopolitical goals, something the Supreme Court said he couldn't do under IEEPA. But trade and sanctions expert Peter Harrell said, as written, the bill would let Trump waive tariffs on Russia, then tariff the EU for refusing to back his war with Iran. Harrell, who was an advisor to Biden, noted Trump already has the authority to sanction Russia, but has barely used it. It makes me a little suspicious, said Harrell. If he does not seem interested in putting pressure on Russia, but does seem interested in this bill, what would his interest be? The tariffs. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Canada celebrates a crucial bridge to U.S. Canada on Friday celebrated the completion of a new bridge to the U.S. over the Detroit River, a multi-billion-dollar, multi-year project that will serve as a critical path for trade and casual travel between the countries. With the 6-lane Gordie Howe International Bridge dominating the skyline behind them, officials lined up in Windsor, Ontario, to hail what one described as one of the most significant infrastructure achievements in Canada's history. Traffic opens Monday. Missing from the event, U.S. and Michigan representatives. Canada scratched a joint gathering after President Trump this week announced 50% tariffs on Canadian goods entering the U.S. The Howe Bridge, seen at top, will create competition. For nearly a century, the privately owned Ambassador Bridge has been the only route for large commercial trucks moving between the U.S. and Canada at Detroit. It will be vital for our economy, Detroit Mayor Mary Sheffield said of the bridge. The bridge is named for Gordie Howe, a legendary Canadian who played hockey for the NHL's Detroit Red Wings. He died in 2016. Children seen at Wright playing pickup hockey during Canada's celebration of the bridge on Friday. The bridge is 1.5 miles long and rises 151 feet above the Detroit River at its highest point. Global economy picks up before fresh energy hit. Business activity in the U.S., Europe, and parts of Asia picked up in July, an indication that the global economy was growing at a moderate pace before the fresh surge in energy prices triggered by the resumption of hostilities between the U.S. and Iran takes a toll. Surveys released by S&P Global on Friday pointed to a rebound in activity following a memorandum of understanding, though that might prove to be short-lived. S&P said its Purchasing Managers Index for the U.S., which measures activity in the services and manufacturing sectors, rose to 53.6 in July from 51.9 in June to reach its highest levels in 8 months. A reading below 50 points to a contraction, while reading above that threshold points to an increase in activity. The PMI for the Eurozone rose to 51.9 in July from 50.0 in June to reach its highest level in 5 months. In the UK, the composite PMI rose to its highest level in 3 months. There were also accelerations recorded in Japan and Australia. Global goods trade rose again in May. World trade flows rose for a second straight month in May, a sign of economic resilience in the face of the conflict in the Middle East that might be challenged by a fresh wave of U.S. tariff hikes. The volume of goods moving across national borders was 1% higher than in April, a month in which flows rose by 0.3%, according to figures released Friday by the Netherlands Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis, also known as the CPB, which has long tracked world trade as a key influence on the Dutch economy. That resilience partly reflects a boom in artificial intelligence-related investment, which has led to a surge in demand for semiconductors and equipment for data centers. Exports from China were up 2.6% on the month, while overseas sales of goods from Japan were up 4%, and imports to the U.S. rose by 2.3%. However, the outlook for the trade during the rest of the year has been clouded by a new wave of tariff increases in the U.S. U.S. is lifting ban on Mexican cattle. Administration aims to ease beef prices after move to curb spread of parasite. By Patrick Thomas. The Agricultural Department is lifting a more than year-long ban on Mexican cattle imports, a move that could ease soaring beef prices. The U.S. plans to resume importing Mexican cattle at the port of entry in Douglas, Arizona, in 30 days and eventually open 2 additional ports of entry in New Mexico. Mexico sends about 1 million calves across the border each year, accounting for 5% of the cattle processed in the U.S. Cattle imports have been cut off since last year to stem the spread of the flesh-eating New World screwworm. The loss of those cattle has exacerbated a shortage of livestock that has squeezed meat packers and sent prices for ground beef and steaks to record levels. Retail ground beef prices are close to $7 a pound on average, while sirloin steaks are more than $14 a pound, according to government data. The move to reopen the border is contentious, with U.S. ranchers concerned about the spread of a parasite with a history of thinning herds and raising costs. Meanwhile, meat industry officials said opening the border is safe and one of the quickest ways to ease beef prices and relieve financial pressure on cattle production in the Southwest. Trump officials are under pressure to show Americans they are taking steps to tame inflation. Agricultural Department Secretary Brooke Rollins said the border decision was made primarily with the protection of U.S. herds in mind, but added the prospect of increased supply could help the market. We have been trading with Mexico live cattle for a really, really long time. The border states rely on it, and we're at a low herd number, Rollins said in an interview. It is time to safely open. Importing cattle into the U.S. from Mexican ranches has occurred for more than a century. The imported livestock are fattened in U.S. feed yards before being transported to large slaughterhouses that process them into beef. The border was closed to cattle imports in November 2024 after the flesh-eating screwworm was detected in southern Mexico. The Trump administration temporarily resumed imports a few months later, but has restricted the cattle trade since May of last year to keep the fly from spreading in the U.S. The parasitic fly has been absent from the U.S. since the 1960s, but in June, agricultural officials identified it in a three-week-old Texas calf. Dozens of U.S. cases have been confirmed since then, with the fly appearing on cattle and other animals. All the cases have been reported in Texas except for one involving a dog in New Mexico. Rollins said the border closure gave the agency time to increase construction of sterile fly facilities, improve surveillance for the parasite along the border, and improve the layers of screening that imported cattle go through. For example, Mexican cattle will move through a disinfectant dip vat when entering a U.S. port of entry. Female screwworm flies only mate once, so the sterile male flies help suppress the parasite's population. Reopening the border is the biggest thing that can happen in the short term to change the beef supply, said Wesley Batista Filho, chief executive of JBS's U.S. division at the Wall Street Journal's Global Food Forum last month. FDA committee votes to ease curbs on peptides by Sarah Ashley O'Brien and Alex Janin. Biohackers, longevity enthusiasts, and alternative medicine doctors want the peptide BPC-157. Now compounders may be one step closer to lawfully providing it. The Food and Drug Administration's Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee voted in favor of easing restrictions on 6 of 7 peptides up for consideration following strong warnings from the agency's scientists. It's now up to the FDA to decide whether to greenlight the drugs for compounding pharmacies to make and pave the way for peptide gold rush. Today, the term peptides often refers to a category of injectable substances that promise physical transformations and haven't undergone regulatory approval. On social media, influencers, alternative medicine doctors, and everyday people have promoted them for everything from muscle recovery to more youthful skin. These peptides are largely sold through an online gray market where they're labeled for research use only or not for human consumption. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has advocated for loosening restrictions on the substances. The rise of peptides has been controversial. Doctors have cited health risks, and the substances have not been studied extensively. Some compounders have already begun making the drugs despite FDA restrictions. During the hearing on Friday, Russell Wesdick, an FDA official in the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, described some of the challenges facing the peptides under review. When you write a script for TB500, what form do you think your patients are getting? He said. Does anybody know? I certainly don't, and that's a challenge for us. At the hearing, the committee members, including pharmacists, doctors, clinic owners, academics, and regulatory experts, evaluated each peptide. Some of the committee members had ties to peptide businesses. The FDA generally follows advisory committee recommendations, but has no obligation to do so. The FDA's career scientists recommended against greenlighting any of the peptides on the list, which come in formulations including injections, nasal sprays, and topical creams. They cited the limited clinical studies as a lack of evidence indicating their effectiveness. Because of inconsistent chemical descriptions and names, they argued that it is impossible to know exactly what substances are being compounded. They also stated that there are FDA drugs approved for the same conditions being evaluated. Shabir Imfer Safdar, executive director of the Partnership for Safe Medicines, a public health coalition focused on supply chain safety, called the affirmative votes a serious setback for patient safety. The committee's recommendation will inevitably be interpreted by many as an endorsement of broader clinical use. It is not, he said in the statement. Patients won't read the fine print. They will hear one thing. The FDA said yes. Last year, 2 women became critically ill at a longevity conference in Las Vegas after they received peptide injections at a booth. An investigation was unable to conclude exactly why the women became ill, but regulators in Nevada fined the doctor who wasn't licensed in their state, along with 2 other people in connection with the incident. A letter to the doctor from the Nevada State Board of Pharmacy said one of the peptide cocktails was believed to contain BBC157 and MOTS-C, 2 peptides the FDA committee voted in favor of. Along with voting in favor of the popular BPC-157, the committee also approved TB500. BPC 157 was evaluated for use in ulcerative colitis and TB 500 for wound healing. The two are often sold together online and called the Wolverine Stack, with claims it can help with everything from muscle and tissue repair to reduced inflammation. The committee also voted favorably for the peptides KPV, Epitalon, and Cmax. The committee voted against one peptide called imideltide, evaluated for opioid withdrawal, chronic insomnia, and narcolepsy. David Pope, a pharmacist who voted affirmatively for other peptides, voted no on this one, citing a complex regimen and, quote, potentially dangerous downstream consequences. Proponents argued that creating an accessible pathway for peptides would help doctors, patients, and regulators gather more evidence about whether or not they work. Some patients say the gray market products have helped them when the traditional medicine system doesn't. Under current regulations, compounders are not required to report serious negative side effects associated with the compounding drug products of the FDA to the FDA. FDA officials said the agency does not have the authority to require it in this case. Scott Brunner, chief executive of compounding industry 8 group, the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding, who spoke in support of peptides, said in an interview that adverse event reporting should be required. There is not the sort of substantive safety data for these drugs that FDA would normally require, he said. The moment that we're in is rather extraordinary, and it calls for a special approach. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Maine Democrats try to turn the page. New likely Senate nominee who once championed Plattner faces a high-wire act, by Ken Thomas and Sabrina Rodriguez. Bangor, Maine. When Graham Plattner burst onto the Maine political scene, former state Senate President Troy Jackson emerged as one of his biggest champions, lauding the oyster farmers' progressive policies and direct appeal to working-class voters. Now, Plattner is the last person Jackson wants to talk about. He quickly severed ties with Plattner after the oysterman withdrew as Maine's Democratic U.S. Senate nominee this month in the midst of allegations of sexual assault. Widely expected to take Plattner's place on the ballot, Jackson faces a delicate high-wire act. On the one hand, he aims to capture the groundswell of populist energy that generated more than 150,000 votes for Plattner in the June primary, a record turnout for Maine Democrats. On the other hand, Jackson must distance himself from his former allies' personal scandals to win over the independents and more moderate women required to unseat Republican Susan Collins. Republicans intend to lash Jackson directly to Plattner's troubled brand, and one GOP super PAC is planning a 7-figure ad campaign beginning next week highlighting those ties, according to a person familiar with the plans. Jackson backed Plattner through the primary campaign, even as Plattner faced mounting scrutiny over sexually explicit text messages, offensive online posts, and a chest tattoo resembling a Nazi symbol before the sexual assault allegations prompted his exit. Jackson, a logger, is expected to secure the party's nomination Saturday during a special state party convention assembled in the aftermath of Plattner's collapse and ahead of a Monday deadline to replace him on the ballot. A poll released by the University of New Hampshire Tuesday found Jackson with a slight edge over Collins. Polling in the past Senate elections have often underestimated Collins' appeal, including surveys released during her 2020 re-election campaign. Like Plattner, Jackson's central message is that the political system, supported by both parties, has enriched the wealthy and corporations. During his 2026 gubernatorial primary run, he was endorsed by Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and appeared alongside Plattner at Fighting Oligarchy rallies. This race is really about the message that Graham Plattner carried, but that Troy Jackson has also carried, that's a populist economic message, said Joseph Gavarese, executive director of Our Revolution, the group founded by Sanders. Collins has pointed to Jackson's long political career, signaling that Jackson will face obstacles in attempting to run as an outsider insurgent campaign. He's been in Augusta for more than 20 years, Collins told reporters in Washington this past week. He clearly embraces the platform of the Democratic Socialists and has views that are pretty far out there. Jackson doesn't identify as a Democratic Socialist. Throughout her career, Collins has sought to forge a bipartisan image and has used her perch on the Senate Appropriations Committee to fund local and state initiatives. But she faces her own headwinds. The election will mark the first time she has faced voters since the Supreme Court in 2022 overturned the constitutional right to an abortion under Roe v. Wade. Collins, who supports abortion rights, said in an interview in June that she didn't regret her vote to confirm Justice Brett Kavanaugh, but did disagree with Kavanaugh's vote to overturn the law. For 30 years, Susan Collins has told us that she's concerned, but when the stakes are the absolute highest, too often she stood with Donald Trump, Jackson said at a recent rally in Portland. While Jackson has won elections in the northern parts of the state that have backed Trump, Democrats said the former legislator will need to move quickly in a general election campaign that will only span about 100 days. He still has to introduce himself to the Maine voters, but a lot of people do know him. I think coming from northern Maine with a background as a logger will endear him to a lot of people, said Democratic U.S. Rep. Shelley Pingree. Ahead of the convention, Jackson has faced increased scrutiny over his shifting political stances on issues like abortion rights and same-sex marriage, and displaying a hot temper in the state legislature. Jackson originally entered politics as a Republican and was opposed to abortion rights and same-sex marriage. But he became a staunch defender of reproductive rights and gay rights, receiving a 100% rating from Planned Parenthood's Maine chapter and Equality Maine, an LGBTQ advocacy group. Republicans noted that Jackson was a third-place finisher in the gubernatorial primary and accused Democrats of engineering Plattner's replacement. Business leaders size up Mamdani appointments by Kevin Dugan and Rebecca Picciotto. New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani has kept the city's business leaders waiting to see his plan to help the local economy grow. This past week, the city's business elite got an unexpected surprise when Mamdani named a new chair of the city's Economic Development Corporation, Lena Khan, the 37-year-old who made her name crusading against the world's largest corporations as head of the Federal Trade Commission during the Biden administration. The appointment of Khan, seen by Wall Street and big tech as hostile to business, sent a jolt through some of the rarefied corners of the business community. But a separate appointment blunted the shock, and for some, is sending mixed signals. Mamdani also appointed Tony Shorus, a trusted hand for the city and business community, as the EDC's president and chief executive. Khan has an adversarial approach to large enterprises, said Stephen Fulop, the CEO of the business organization Partnership for New York City. Pairing these two leaders sends a confusing and conflicted signal about which philosophy will define the agency's work going forward, and it remains unclear to us what direction NYCEDC will ultimately take. The pair will work together to set the agenda for the nation's most economically important city. The EDC is in charge of doling out city-owned land, tax incentives, and financing subsidies for large-scale developments. The dual appointments open a new question: who's really running New York City's economic policy? Mamdani has shown he is willing to work with businesses. The mayor recently proposed changes to some regulations on small businesses, such as no longer requiring restaurants to obtain a special permit to serve ice cream. Julie Su, Mamdani's deputy mayor for economic justice, referenced Shorus's experience going after tax cheats as an example of the kind of work that fits into the mayor's agenda for economic justice. She said building affordable housing, creating high-paying jobs, and opening city-run grocery stores are among the City Hall's priorities. Developers and business leaders say they assume Shorus will actively steer the city's policy because CEOs of the agency typically set the agenda. Board chairs historically have rarely overridden executives. Yet, those who know Khan said she is unlikely to serve as a figurehead. Khan is very curious, always asking good questions, loves to get into the details of how businesses work and the specific hurdles facing new businesses, said Zephyr Teachout, a Fordham University professor who has focused on antitrust and who co-wrote a 2014 law review paper with Khan. Khan, as a member of Mamdani's transition team, had interviewed candidates for the role of EDC president and referenced the idea of reining in corporate power. Those acquainted with how the EDC works say that as chair, Khan will have a less powerful role than Shorus, but will be working with a few dozen of the city's business, nonprofit, and labor leaders to bring in large development projects and find ways to stimulate new industries. The position might prove awkward. Microsoft, Amazon.com, Meta Platforms, and the parent company of Coach and Kate Spade are companies Khan has singled out for anti-competitive behavior, either as a professor or as the FTC chair. Shores has worked as a partner at McKinsey, and his municipal experience stretches back to the 1980s. Lots of folks took a sigh of relief, said Carlos Cesura, CEO of the New York Building Congress, a developer trade group. The fact that Tony knows the industry, knows the projects, is a good thing. Real estate leaders are watching a few projects as bellwethers for whether the odd couple of Khan and Shores will work. One of them is the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, a $3.5 billion project to transform a waterfront into a maritime district with an all-electric shipping port and thousands of new apartments. The project has been moving sluggishly for 2 years amid local pushback. Developers are also watching for any progress on new science research campus in Manhattan's Kips Bay neighborhood and the revamped boulevard stretching along Fifth Avenue from Bryant Park to Central Park. In the next few months, let's see if money is released. Let's see if projects are approved. Let's see how fast an executive director is hired for the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, said Cesura. Turning now to opinion. AI Wars, The Empire Strikes Back. Business World by Holman W. Jenkins, Jr. Maybe artificial intelligence is just around the corner after all. How else to explain those tech CEOs who usually can't get enough change suddenly wanting it throttled? Never mind that their complaints have the paradoxical flavor of the old Borscht Belt joke. The food was no good and the portions were too small. Alex Karp of Palantir. Or they say industry leaders Anthropic and OpenAI are Trojan horses. They're out to steal their customers' businesses, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella. Or Apple is so far behind OpenAI in artificial intelligence, it can only be because OpenAI is stealing from them, Apple. Tim Cook. Elon Musk is exempted from our general snark. He has already moved on from assailing the frontier labs to milking them by selling them compute at a steep markup. In the process, he managed to get his SpaceX IPO out the door that's possibly closing on his rivals, given reports that OpenAI may be delaying its launch indefinitely. Not that the established tech CEOs are Luddites exactly, but their shareholders aren't paying them to forego any lever to protect their existing businesses against the AI tsunami. A bandwagon unbravenly beckons. It consists not only of college students booing AI and waddling seniors raging on Facebook against data centers. The U.S. government is hovering its heavy hand in ways already being distorted for polemical purposes. Anthropic, acting to limit its own liability, voluntarily held back Mythos earlier this year. It enabled responsible parties to patch flaws in their cybersecurity exposed by the model's superhuman capabilities. This demonstrates the value of America's lead, but it isn't clear government has a better solution to the safety risks, even as it threatens to turn the lab's billion-dollar superintelligence bets into lose-lose propositions. If the companies are wrong, they're out invest sums. If they're right, the capabilities they reveal may be so powerful that Washington will insist on monopolizing them for safety and geopolitical reasons. Don't fail to notice a simultaneous bifurcation between those who believe the race for superintelligence is everything and those who think seeding good enough AI through the economy is the game now. Users, including Fortune 500 companies, are turning to unregulated, possibly purloined, open-weight Chinese AI models to save money and avoid exposing their data to the big domestic labs. They're accepting not only Beijing snooping and cyber sabotage risk. If there's any scenario in which a recursively self-improving AI establishes itself on the internet to terrorize computer users until the end of time and eventually take over part of the galaxy, it will be a Chinese open-weight AI. Unlike electricity, to which AI is often compared, users don't have to wait for a power line or the invention of capacitors, insulating materials, and electric motors. Witness the latest unpleasant, awe-inspiring revelation from OpenAI. One of its developmental models recently sneaked out of its supposedly secure testing environment, raided another company's servers, and stole a solution to a complex testing problem. OpenAI was simultaneously preening and apologetic. Such agentic or problem solving AI may soon give rise to the first Fortune 500 company from somebody's bedroom. A coherent government would be forming a coherent response, but an outcome already seems likely. Pursuit of the highest end capabilities will increasingly become a regulated activity, if not subordinated completely to national security. Lesser, detuned, or copycat AIs will do the disruptive work of rewiring the everyday economy. Naturally, special interests are organizing. Lobbying is a legitimate activity, but so is making sure the national interest prevails. Henry Clay was a Jeffersonian pastoralist until he woke up, after the War of 1812, to a realization. The U.S. couldn't sit out the race to industrialize, and particularly in supposedly unsavory international finance, if it wanted to be in control of its own destiny in a rivalrous international order. Having somehow preserved its internal culture of experimentation and freedom for 250 years, the U.S. now is disproportionately relied on to generate wealth and technological advances for the 6.6% of humanity that reside in full democracies and the 38.4% that live in flawed democracies. China's Xi Jinping complains that AI should be a symphony of international cooperation. It already is. Everybody with talent and ambition comes to America to build it. Maybe AI is an unusual case. Its dynamic potential is greater than a resilient and sturdy political system can absorb. But you wouldn't want to make this determination based on the shrieking of the self-interested. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The Economics of the World Cup by Roland Fryer. The most tempting column for an economist to write about the World Cup is the teardown, and I had it drafted before the opening match. The argument is simple. The benefits of hosting are oversold and the costs barely counted. When the tournament last came to America in 1994, boosters promised host cities $4 billion in gains. Economists later reported up to $9.3 billion in losses. FIFA's consultants projected this World Cup would add $17.2 billion to American gross domestic product. The receipts are still coming in. Card spending jumped. Restaurants and bars had their best months in years. But the national picture is what matters, and the gains wash out against the tourists who stayed home and the jobs that never came. The economist Victor Matheson put it plainly. The World Cup is making us happy. There's not a lot of evidence it's making us rich. Consider what else we could buy. Closing the racial achievement gap in math is achievable with targeted investments of approximately $1,700 a child each year over a 3-year period. The intervention raised math achievement by 0.184 standard deviation a year in elementary school and 0.146 in secondary school. Economists estimate each standard deviation of achievement is worth $110,000 to $230,000 in lifetime earnings. So the $10 billion buys roughly 3 years of what gain for 2 million children, about a $200 billion increase. But to get to the truth, I have to leave my bubble for the real world. When I was reforming public schools, I sat in them every week. So I went to a match with my family and friends, Norway versus Iraq, to see the traffic and overpriced hot dogs for myself. I found much less traffic than expected. I saw canopies of Iraqi flags, bodies out every window, everyone dancing to a faint hip-hop pulse. The walk-in was a collision of cultures that seemed to enjoy each other. I struck out looking for one of those ridiculous horned Viking hats and settled for a green Iraqi trucker cap. I put it on and instantly made new friends. My generation has lived through 2 American wars with Iraq, but I'd never met Iraqis, danced to their music, or heard their anthem. And that distance does something quiet and dangerous. It sets the price of our credulity. Tell us tomorrow that Canada is a threat, and we'd laugh. We know Canada. We've stood in it. We can see their faces. Tell us the same thing about Iraq, and it goes down easier. In minute 39, while I was doing the Norwegians Viking row in my Iraqi hat, Iraq scored. It tied the game. Norway would pull away, and the goal will appear in no history of the tournament. But it is the most important goal I saw all summer. The man in front of us dropped to his knees, threw his hands to the sky, and screamed that he never thought he would live to see his country score in a World Cup. His face was wet and gushing with joy. I couldn't make the old story fit what was in front of me, and I wondered something an economist isn't supposed to wonder. If two peoples could meet like this before their governments narrated them to each other, might peace have a little more room to work? Borders don't dissolve because a stadium sang together, and no treaty was signed in Foxborough, Massachusetts that night, but governments answer, eventually, to publics. And a public that has stood shoulder to shoulder with the people it was taught to fear is harder to march to war. Years ago, Matthew Jackson and I built a model of how the mind sorts information into categories for cognitive efficiency. We found that prejudice needs no hatred. You sort the people you meet often into fine categories. The rest get lumped into coarse blocks. Iraqi, for an American who has met Iraq only through 2 wars, is a coarse sorting. 40 million people in a bin or two. The cure is more interaction. I watched it happen at the World Cup. A stadium takes the coarse block and for a few hours forces the finer sort my model said was missing. My wife, a proud Austrian, felt it too and asked what it would be like not to witness this but to feel it, to stand in a section for your own country. So I dusted off my lederhosen and we traveled to Kansas City, Missouri for Austria versus Algeria. The Algerians had the better music, but the Austrians were more committed, belting "I am from Austria" for what felt like hours, swaths of my wife's countrymen in full voice. Austria and Algeria are separated by language, religion, history, and the Mediterranean. None of it seemed to matter. Still, I did what a social scientist does. I went to the barbecue joints to ask my questions. Was the traffic more intense than usual? Was the pit master busier than a normal Saturday? Did they find us outsiders annoying? A man ahead of me in line at Slaps BBQ, a former professional barbecue judge, ignored all of it and told me instead that he was proud the world finally got to see Kansas City, that they aren't flyover country, and that the folks here are kind and well-educated. He wasn't answering my question, he was correcting it. Then he sent me home with 2 bottles of his favorite sauce, 1 spicy, 1 sweet. Multiply that man by a stadium, then every stadium across 39 days, and you start to see what the typical economic analysis was never built to count. America's 2 decades in Iraq and the war on terror cost somewhere between $2 trillion and $8 trillion, depending on who's counting. If everything was just witnessed made one such war 0.2% less likely, FIFA's $17.2 billion is the smaller number. I can't estimate how much a tournament moves the odds of a war, but the evidence is at least suggestive. Emilio de Petris Chauvin and his co-authors found that African survey just after a national team victory identified less by ethnic group and trusted other ethnicities more, and that countries barely qualifying for the Cup of Nations saw about 9% fewer civil conflict episodes in the months after. 0.2% is a rounding error on a rounding error, and I wouldn't bet against a stadium full of Iraqis and Norwegians sorting one another more finely to clear it. I went to my first World Cup to price it, to see if the benefits were oversold. They are, but that measures the wrong thing. The real return isn't in hotel occupancy or pounds of ribs sold. It's in the 90 minutes when 40 million Iraqis narrowed to 1, a man weeping over a goal that meant nothing and everything. Nobody can put that into a spreadsheet. We ended up, for a few hours at a time, seeing one another in higher resolution. Mr. Fryer, a journal contributor, is a professor of economics at Harvard, a founder of Equal Opportunity Ventures, and a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. The homeless boom in Los Angeles. Tens of thousands of people have left Los Angeles since the pandemic, but one group isn't leaving, the homeless. A new city report finds that the number of people living on the streets keeps rising. Maybe there's a connection between population flight and vagrancy. The city's overall homeless population rose 3.4%, including those the city puts up in motels. The number sleeping outside in encampments or vehicles rose 7.9%. All told, the city counted 45,194 homeless in January, up from 35,550 in 2019 and 41,980 in 2022 when Mayor Karen Bass was elected. Ms. Bass has squandered hundreds of millions of dollars on homeless programs that appear to have no effect. Under her signature program, the city has spent $82,420 a year for each homeless person it has sheltered in motels. Some 40% have returned to the streets, often because of drug addictions. A third-party audit of LA's homeless agency last year found the city wasn't tracking how much was being spent, the number of beds or other services being provided, or outcomes for putative beneficiaries. Federal Judge David Carter, who presided over a lawsuit against the city, expressed astonishment at the findings. "Nobody is asking our providers what they did or what services they performed," he said. "We may have providers who committed fraud, and we may never know. Ms. Bass would prefer voters not know." In November, she faces a mayoral runoff against City Councilwoman Nithya Raman, a Democratic Socialist of America member who opposes clearing the encampments. Angelenos, tired of feces and needles on the sidewalks, can look forward to more of the same. Letters to the editor. Betrayals can't hurt Israel as it did Vietnam. Regarding your editorial on Israel, Echoes of Past Betrayals, July 17th, Democrats' refusal to aid the South Vietnamese government in its hour of need of 1975 reflected the culmination of pressure from the organized anti-war mobilizations of the era. The underlying rationale for cutting aid to the South was that the North Vietnamese communists were true nationalists, seeking only to unify their country, while the Thieu government was a puppet regime owned by so-called U.S. imperialism. Democrats had come to accept the revolutionary socialist critique of the war, just as now many are embracing the Democratic Socialists of America's anti-Israel critique. That critique goes beyond antipathy to Benjamin Netanyahu. It strikes at the right of Israel to exist as a nation while embracing the maximalist program of the pro-Palestinian left. It was no accident that New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani refused to march on Israel Day in a city with the largest Jewish population outside of Israel. The difference between 1975 and now, however, is that Israel is well capable of standing on its own with a mature military-industrial complex and a substitute procurement access in militarizing Germany. The Army of South Vietnam, having fought successfully for 2 years after the U.S. withdrawal of combat personnel, was nevertheless in a comparatively weaker state. Faced with North Vietnamese regulars, permitted by the 1973 U.S. Hanoi Treaty to remain in the South, and with the ubiquitous presence of Viet Cong guerrilla forces, the U.S. cutting off aid inevitably worked toward its demise. Israel, in contrast, is well positioned on its own to defeat Iran's auxiliaries and to vanquish the so-called militants on the West Bank who would stir up an intifada. Israel's government is a strong democracy, the only one in the region, which alone should speak to the U.S. national interest, while the Thieu regime still depended on authoritarian rule, which weakened its prospects for survival. By Albion M. Erdank, Los Angeles. And finally, on This We Can Agree, Let's Stop Wildfires, by Senator John Curtis, a Republican from Utah. Your editorial, Trump and Bernie Political Smoke Jumpers, July 18th, is right that our forests are ill-managed. Whether from the latest smoke drifting south from Canada or record-breaking fires here at home, the lesson is the same. We have neglected active forest management for far too long. Both parties share this blame. The result is denser forests, more fuel on the ground, and larger, hotter fires that threaten lives, communities, and the air we all breathe. But while you rightly criticize recent political finger-pointing, you fail to mention that bipartisan turnkey solutions exist in this Congress. The Fix Our Forests Act, which I am proud to co-lead with colleagues from both parties, has enough support to overcome a 60-vote filibuster threshold in the Senate and has already passed the House. It fixes the root issue of our forest management, inadequate resources, and an overly burdensome regulatory environment rife with litigation. There's another widely bipartisan bill we introduced this week with ideologically broad bipartisan support. The Wildfires Emissions Prevention Act would address a glaring irony in our current regulations. They deter prescribed burns due to pollution concerns. By avoiding these controlled burns, we practically guarantee catastrophic wildfires that emit far more carbon than proactive management ever would. These and many other bills are practical solutions that are ready to become law. Cleaner air begins with better managed forests. The support for these solutions proves that it isn't a Republican or Democratic idea. It's common sense. Yet by our own doing, Washington is suffocating.
The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability